I'm Megan Garfinkel, and as you just mentioned, I'm going to be telling you a little bit about a project that I worked on with a team of researchers at the biology department at UIC. I worked on this project for about 2.5 years, and we were focusing on the ecology of these rights-of-ways in the greater Chicago metropolitan area. So just a little bit of background on the Commonwealth Edison Company, or ComEd, for those of you that might not be familiar. They are one of the largest landowners in Illinois. So we can see, we've got a map here showing the locations of a lot of those rights-of-ways. We've got Chicago over here by the lake, and then you can see that the rights-of-ways extend all throughout northern Illinois. So they are a fairly large area that they encompass overall. And so ComEd has over 56,000 acres of right-of-way corridors. And just to mention, throughout this talk, I'll sometimes call them rights-of-ways, sometimes call them corridors. Those will be interchangeable. But so yeah, they've got over 56,000 acres, and of those, about 550 acres are managed as prairie habitat, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next couple of slides. Sorry about that. So we had two main goals that we wanted to address when we were starting this project. We wanted to know first how these ComEd rights-of-ways would contribute to the overall biodiversity of the region. And then we also wanted to know how they would contribute to the ecological health of the region. So to get at those questions, we started by looking at the ways that the vegetation was managed in these rights-of-ways. You probably noticed from the map on a couple of slides ago that the rights-of-ways are located in a variety of different areas. So we've got rights-of-ways that are out in really rural areas, and most of the time when they're over corn or soybean fields, for instance, they'll just be farmed along with the surrounding fields. But in those residential areas that are, more urban or suburban, we found that there's really three main categories of vegetation management that we're seeing. And of course, all of this vegetation management, the main goal is just to stop any woody vegetation or tall trees, things like that, from encroaching on the area so that they don't get tall enough to, of course, touch the power lines. So in these residential areas, what we found was that in some cases we had rights-of-ways that were managed as what we call mowed or lawn type management. And so these are areas where we've got basically turf grass that's growing, not native grass species. They're mowed throughout the growing season to keep them relatively short. And so they end up looking basically like lawns. And then we have what we refer to as the old field management. This is the default management that's conducted on a 5-year cycle. So they go through on this 5-year cycle and they generally do some brush mowing and apply herbicides. But what you end up with is a site that looks like a little weedier. The vegetation tends to be much taller than what you see at the mowed sites. And a lot of times you'll have some invasive plant species and non-native plant species. So just sort of weedy type old field. And then the final category that we see is these prairie sites. So prairies are either in locations where we've got remnant prairies that the right-of-way happens to be running over, in which case they're just continued to be managed as prairie. But in a lot of cases, these are actually restored prairie sites. So these are sites where we've got, at one point they went through and they reseeded the area with native wildflowers and prairie plants, and they're maintained to stop invasive plant species from coming in and to keep that as sort of a prairie habitat. So going back to addressing our original questions of how the rights-of-ways contribute to the overall ecological health of the region, we wanted to start by taking an ecosystem services approach. So we wanted to know, how does the right-of-way management style affect the ecosystem services that those rights-of-ways can provide to the surrounding areas? And I apologize if this is information that everyone's already familiar with, but just really quickly, ecosystem services are the benefits that people get from nature. They're often separated into these 4 categories. So we've got regulating services, things like pollination, provisioning services, things like food supporting, which would be nutrient cycling, photosynthesis, and then cultural services, which are things like aesthetics, recreational opportunities, et cetera. So basically, these rights of ways, even though they're sort of an informal type of green space, they have the potential to provide a variety of different types of ecosystem services to the surrounding area. And we wanted to know not only how does the right-of-way vegetation management style affect these ecosystem services, but also are there any trade-offs in the ecosystem services that we see? So for instance, does one style of management maximize supporting services and another style of management maybe maximizes cultural services? So we had a bunch of sub-projects that we did looking at different types of ecosystem services that were provided by these rights of ways and how they're affected by the vegetation management. I'm just going to tell you quickly about 2 of these little sub-projects. First, I'm going to tell you about our project looking at how the vegetation management affects biodiversity in the right-of-way. And so biodiversity has a lot of cascading effects on different types of ecosystem services. So for instance, often if you have higher pollinator biodiversity, you'll have more pollination services. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project that I did looking at cultural ecosystem services as well. So just to give you an overview of how we approached this, we conducted this study over a few different summers. And so we had different sites that we used in different years, but this is just a map showing an example of some of the sites that we had. And what you can see is that we had these clusters and geographic locations at varying distances from Chicago. So some of them were a little more urban, some of them were a little more suburban, and we had some sites that were closer to the rural end of things, but still suburban residential areas. And at each of these locations, we found a study site that was maintained as prairie, one that was old field, and one that was a mowed or lawn type of corridor. And then on top of that, at each location, we also had these residential sites. So these were areas where we got permission from homeowners to go into their backyards and front yards and actually survey the biodiversity that were in their yards themselves. And the reason that we did this was because we wanted to have a sort of baseline of comparison for what type of biodiversity is already in the surrounding residential areas so that we could see if the rights of ways were actually supporting different or more biodiversity than what we see in people's backyards already. We focused on 3 groups of biodiversity. Oh, I'm sorry. Can everyone still see that? I think we've got there. We focused on 3 groups for our biodiversity surveys. We looked at the birds at the sites, we looked at pollinating insects, and then we also looked at plants. And in case it's not obvious, this picture to the left, these are 3 little American woodcock chicks that I came across when I was doing a survey of one of the prairie corridors. I included them because they're pretty adorable little puffballs, and they're very well camouflaged, so they're unusual to find. I'm going to start by just really quickly going over how the numbers of species differed by the different types of vegetation management in the rights of ways and in the nearby residential yards. So what we're looking at here is a comparison of the number of species of moths and butterflies based on the vegetation management. And what we see is that we found more species of moths and butterflies in both the old field corridors and the prairies, and fewer in the residential yards and the mowed corridors. And in some cases, what we were seeing was actually surprisingly high number of species that were in the old field corridors, in some cases more than what we were seeing in the prairies as well. When we look at the number of plant species, we see similar patterns. Again, both the old field and the prairie corridors are supporting more plants than what we're seeing in the mowed corridors and the residential yards. And if we look at a subset of that, only looking at the native plants that are located in these study sites, we see that the prairies are supporting significantly more native plants than the old field corridors. But the old field corridors are also supporting more than what we're seeing in both the residential yards and the mowed corridors. And finally, we saw similar patterns with the birds as well. So what we're seeing is, again, both the old field corridors and the prairies are supporting more species of birds than we're seeing in the mowed corridors. So that tells us a little bit about how the numbers of species compare between these management types. But we were also interested in what species were found based on these management types. So we also did an analysis and that was looking at the types of species, the communities that we were finding. And what we found was that within a given community, for instance, a community of pollinators, the types of species, the types of pollinators that we would see at a prairie site were going to be different than the types of pollinators that we would see, for instance, at a mowed site. So this, we found this for, again, birds, plants, and pollinators. And this pattern is really telling us that the management is going to affect the types of species that we see at a site. And what we found in general was that although in many cases the old field sites had surprisingly high numbers of species, mostly the prairies were supporting some of the more uncommon species or species of more conservation concern. So for instance, monarchs, we were more likely to find them in the prairie sites than at the other types. So moving on to our sub-project looking at cultural ecosystem services. And again, these are those non-material benefits that people get from nature. So things like aesthetics, a sense of well-being, recreational opportunities. We were interested in looking at this for two reasons. And first was that when we were out there during the first year of the study, we noticed that people were using the rights-of-ways in some really interesting ways. So this picture on the left is showing a house where we have, I think it's a load of gravel that's been dumped in the right-of-way, and they've mowed a little area, placed a chair out, and they've sort of turned that into a seating area as an extension of their backyard. And then on the right, we've got a picture of one of the gardens that people had planted. We saw this in a couple different places where people had planted these gardens right in the middle of the right-of-way. So people are using these rights-of-ways in interesting ways. The second reason we wanted to know about cultural ecosystem services is because we had discussed with our contacts at ComEd, and what they had told us was that sometimes these rights-of-ways are converted to a lawn type of management after people have complained about the vegetation management in the right-of-way. So that made us wonder if maybe people preferred these lawn type of rights-of-ways, and maybe there are trade-offs here in the types of ecosystem services that people are seeing. So what we are, we wanted to see, are people actually preferring these rights-of-ways that are mowed versus ones that maybe are supporting more biodiversity. So in order to get at these questions, I went out and conducted a survey of homeowners that were living next to rights-of-ways. I went door to door and asked them some questions about the ways that they used and felt about the rights-of-ways. And I did this for people that were living next to prairie corridors, as well as the old field and the lawn managed rights-of-ways. And some of the things that I found from that survey were first that most of the respondents to the survey believe that it actually is important that the right-of-way should provide habitat for wildlife. I also found that of all of the activities that people reported doing in the right-of-way, and so this was could include things like jogging in the right-of-way or using it as an area for their kids to play, walking a dog. The most frequently reported activity that people did in the right-of-way was wildlife observation. So this would be bird watching. We had some comments about people about how much they enjoyed watching the deer or the coyotes or the hawks, anything like that in the right-of-way. So this seemed to be an important service that people were getting from these more biodiverse rights-of-ways. And then finally, we found that the management category didn't actually affect the probability that someone had made a formal complaint about the vegetation. So for instance, if you lived at a lawn type of corridor, you would be just as likely to have submitted a formal complaint about the vegetation as if you lived next to an old field corridor. And I just wanted to share two of the specific questions that we had on the survey that I thought were really interesting. So what we're looking at here is the results of the responses to the statement, "I'm happy with the way ComEd maintains vegetation in the right-of-way by my house." So everything in gray in the middle is the percent of the respondents that neither agree nor disagree. And then we've got agreement in red and orange. And then in blue, we've got agreement. And these are separated out by the type of corridor that people lived next to. And what we found, that there's really not a major difference in how people responded to this question, "I'm happy with the way ComEd maintains the vegetation," based on the type of corridor that they live by. But on the other hand, for the statement, "the right-of-way is aesthetically pleasing or attractive," what we found was that there is actually a significant difference in the way that people respond to this based on the type of corridor that they live by. So people that lived by a mowed corridor actually were more likely to disagree that it is aesthetically pleasing or attractive. And if you lived by a prairie or an old field corridor, you were more likely to agree and think that it is actually aesthetically pleasing or attractive. So between this and some of those other survey results that we were finding, it seems that people are not actually preferring these mowed type of corridors. And in fact, in terms of the cultural services that they get from these rights-of-ways, one of the main ones that people are getting is the ability to watch the wildlife that is near their house. So that would suggest that the sites that are more biodiverse, that are supporting more species, might actually be better for cultural services. People might appreciate that more. And so overall, this is telling us that we're not actually seeing a major trade-off in these ecosystem services. The mowed types of corridors seem to be not as good for people in several ways, and of course not as good for wildlife in terms of the number of species and the types of species that they can support. So just to summarize a few of those things, first we found that the rights-of-ways can add biodiversity value to the landscape, depending on that vegetation management type. So they're supporting more and different types of species than we're seeing in the people's backyards in the residential landscape. These old field, weedy or neglected looking sites can actually support a considerable biodiversity and a surprisingly large number of species, although we did find that the prairie sites are more likely to support some of those less common species. And finally, we found that it seems that managing for human enjoyment is fully compatible with managing for biodiversity. So people, again, are getting these cultural services from the sites that are also supporting higher levels of biodiversity. So I'd like to just thank ComEd, of course, for funding this project, and then mention the team of people that has been working on this project. Cheryl Hostler is a grad student at UIC who has been doing a lot of really cool work with the pollinators in the rights-of-ways and pollination services as well. And then Doctors Miner and Whalen are the co-PIs on this project, and they've been working on this since the very beginning. And I think, I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but if we do, I'd be happy to take any.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I think we do, Megan. And thank you so much for this presentation. I know you originally gave this presentation at a meeting that we had with some right-of-way organizations in the Chicago area. And we were so impressed with just the relevance of this research to a lot of the questions that we've been thinking about, here with the Monarch CCAA and generally with the Rights Ways Habitat Working Group, that we thought this would be a great addition to this meeting. So thank you again for presenting again. And I know there have been a couple of questions in the chat, some of which Sarah has been answering here as we're going through. But one question I see here was from Rick about the mowed sites, if the routine mowed sites are due to grass height ordinances. I don't know if that's a question for you, Megan, or Sarah.
That might be more Sarah.
Sure. So typically we're only doing, integrated vegetation management for woody vegetation.
Okay. And then the mowed sites, do you typically have height restrictions that are kind of forcing that?
If we're talking about grass mow, yes, it's due to either customers complaining or municipalities that have specifically requested us to mow.
Okay.
So the only times we're mowing is because some outside entity has said, you must mow here.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. Eric is asking if you can drop your citations into the chat when you have a chance.
I'll need a minute to do that, but yeah, we have 3 papers on this right now. So one is focused on those cultural services, one is focused on the differences in biodiversity, and then we've got a paper that is just going through the final rounds of revisions, which is looking specifically at the pollinator data that Cheryl's been collecting. And we've got a few more that are in the works as well. So I will pull those together. And also, if anyone has, more specific questions, feel free to email me. My email is, I'll just bring up the introduction slide. And my email is at the bottom.
Perfect. And not to put you on the spot, we can also email out those citations at the end or after the meeting. But if you have them handy, you can drop them into chat.
And Iris, I don't know if you want me to try to answer that last question regarding the bumblebee data.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. So we have all the endangered species mapped in our GIS system. And so prior to VEG doing work, they check that system and contact environmental prior. And so if there's requirements or rusty patch bumblebee, then we would guide them accordingly.
And just our end of that, we did do quite a bit of pollinator surveying over a couple of different years and using a couple of different methods. I don't believe that we detected any rusty patched bumblebees at any of the sites, but we do have a lot of that data, and those analyses are going to be I can link you guys to that paper about the pollinators as well. So yeah, we do have some really interesting pollinator data.
Excellent. Any other questions for Megan or Sarah?
I see a question about, has ComEd used a botanist to identify the species of plants in the different habitats? And Sarah, you probably know about some of that on your end. On our end, we do have lists of not only the plant species that we were detecting, so we did, we set up little quadrats where we were recording all of the different species that we were finding at these sites, but we also have information on the flowering plants as well. So specifically, what plants are in flower at what different times, and the amount of cover of those different types of flowering plants to sort of get at some of those questions about the pollinators as well.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that additional information. Great. Okay, well, thank you again so much, Megan, for the presentation. And Sarah, again, your support of this research. Again, I think this is really fascinating to see this documented, and several of people have noted in the chat to have this also be published, I think is really helpful. So great work to the team on this project and the related projects.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to Megan and the UIC team. Absolutely.